It is a great honor to welcome Seth Kaplan to this podcast. He is the lecturer at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. And today we're discussing his wonderful new book, Fragile Neighborhoods, Repairing American Society One Zip Code at a Time. Welcome to the show, Seth. Good to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. Great pleasure to talk with you today.
Yeah, it's, the pleasure is all mine. So, of course, the news has come out that J.D. Vance, the author of the bestseller Hillbilly Elegy, is being selected as Donald Trump's running mate in the presidential race. It's 2024 is going to be a big year, I suppose, for American politics at large with all that has happened so far. Um, you've quoted Vance's book in your text. So, how do you comment on Vance's current position as well as the book and its value in American political discourse?
Well, first, I mostly don't talk politics. My mission is stronger relationships, stronger neighborhoods, and I think our emphasis should be on working together to build better places, not fighting over what are often distant, abstract things that often don't have big impact for us on a day-to-day basis, as opposed to our neighborhoods and our neighbors have a big impact. But I think his book is there's a lot to learn from his book. It's a really good book. I think he could have had a different trajectory in his life, that he could have been more of an author. I mean, he's really smart. He went to Yale Law School and so on and so forth. So he certainly could have had a different life in which he was speaking of of the American culture, the American society. I think what's most interesting about what he writes about, and I did read this book many years ago when it first came out, and it's been quite some years. But what I found useful from his book is he really describes community breakdown. He describes family breakdown. He describes in detail many of the problems that parts of America face. And I think to the extent that populism gains traction in the United States or other countries, I mean, there's many causes, but one cause certainly is that a large segment of the population feels not listened to, feels that policies are not responding to their needs, and therefore populists rise and channel that anger, that dissatisfaction. And even if he was never a politician, I think what he writes in his book shows, I mean, a part of America that maybe many people did not know so much about. And so I think it's really good for people to understand the difficulties that people face. And I think too many elites, they have what's recently been called luxury values, and they don't actually know the problems of real people. And that can be everything from trade policy to social policy to ideas about family and place and neighborhood. And I write about some of that. I mean, I'm trying to be very practical. J.D. Vance wasn't very practical. It was more his life story. But I do think we can learn about a part of America by reading his work, and also seeing some of the anger that is being funneled by his party right now.
Yes, of course. So you've mentioned the phrase elite, and I think there have been ample hostility when it comes to um, uh, directed at the American elites at the time, and the global elites in general. So has it always been the case that American elites have been out of touch with the American public, or has it only been a recent phenomenon?
I think you can answer this question in multiple ways. We always have elites. Elites are always experiencing life differently than most of us are experiencing. Even if you look at the Soviet Union, and what the Communist Party elite in the Soviet Union experienced in terms of their lives was quite different than a worker in a factory. So, I mean, we're talking there's no society without elites in some form. And I think America culturally is somewhat anti-elite, maybe more than some other countries. I cannot think of another country in which the culture actually is so anti-elite, so anti-hierarchy. It's something to do with the way the country was founded, built, expanded. So I think we have to start with that. But I do think, broadly speaking, I think when elites were place-based, were tied to their cities, tied to their towns, we're not national, we're not global. Their economic fortunes depended upon their towns and places and cities doing well. They acted quite differently than they act today. Today, I mean, it's partly how they've been trained. It's also partly the incentives. It's partly the scale. People who are elites, they're much more self-interested. They're much more driven by profit or by career or getting ahead. They do not pay a penalty in the same way for ignoring the rest of us. And they don't feel a sense of stewardship. I think stewardship is a really important word that we don't use very much. When you're tied to a place and the place is of a human scale, even if you're an elite, you almost have no choice but to be a steward of some nature. I mean, you could be self-interested and you would be ostracized and you would pay a price because you live among those people. But to the extent that your fate and your fortune depends upon a place, you are a steward and you act differently. And I think that's been the big change. We don't have stewards anymore. We have distant elites with no connection to the rest of us.
Now, as I've mentioned in the beginning, your current institution is Johns Hopkins, which is based in Baltimore, Maryland. So how would you judge the quality of the neighborhoods within that city?
Well, I teach in Washington, D.C., so I'm a little bit of part of an orphaned part of the school. But I think one of the things about Baltimore, and Baltimore is not unique, but it is certainly, if you've ever been to Baltimore, I don't know, have you been to Baltimore?
Uh,
Do you know anything about
I
Baltimore?
have not, but my father, who's a nutritionist, he's been in Johns Hopkins, and yeah, he saw that there's a lot of poverty and homelessness, mostly amongst the Black population.
Yeah, so Baltimore is a place in which neighborhoods matter a lot, and it has a lot of bad neighborhoods, and it has had a lot of people who fled the city, partially for racial reasons, and in over many, many decades. And the city is, I wouldn't say doing very well, doing poorly, I think would be a safe assessment. It's not so safe. It's not so financially strong. So I think what you see is it's not unusual. The city has a few key assets. Johns Hopkins University is one of the assets. And to the extent that that asset, the harbor would be another asset. In fact, if you look at a map of Baltimore and you were to go neighborhood by neighborhood and decide what was thriving and what was fragile, and I like to plot neighborhoods from fragile to flourishing. So if you were to look at that continuum and you were to look at the neighborhoods, you would likely find the best neighborhoods or the best, not all, some of them are more periphery, but I think those two assets, to the extent that you have other good neighborhoods, they're likely near one of those assets. And so the challenge is you have a city with a lot of bad neighborhoods, a lot of poverty, and the university is among the wealthiest universities in the world, very successful in many areas. And I think a huge question, I think for the university, and I don't play any role in managing the university, but what can the university do to uplift the city, uplift the neighborhoods in the city? I know there are some initiatives. I know there has been some efforts, but surely the university must play a huge role if Baltimore is ever going to come back and be strong, and if many of those neighborhoods are going to be significantly better than they are today. I mean, if you want to see inequality in neighborhoods, go to a few of the best, wealthiest neighborhoods, and then go to some of the worst in Baltimore. You will get such a dichotomy, you will almost can't believe you're in the same country, never mind the same city.
So, what can the university educated class, whether within the universities, like currently as academics or without as professionals, what are some of the lessons or some of the key ideas that they can learn in order to uh, be more connected with the general public?
Well, why don't we go back to your previous question and say, what could Johns Hopkins do that would uplift more of the neighborhoods in Baltimore? And I can't tell you if they're doing a lot of it. I have my master's is from the University of Pennsylvania, and one of the more well-known neighborhood revitalization efforts was the University of Pennsylvania in West Philadelphia. Now, I can't say that all the residents benefited because I know there was some gentrification, but the thing was, there was a lot of investments in buildings and green spaces and other things. And West Philadelphia is remarkably different than it was 30 years ago, for example. So, but if I go back to Baltimore and Johns Hopkins, there's a few very practical things that they could do. They could more intentionally hire people from from the city, but they could specifically say is we're going to adopt or we're going to partner with these let's say 3 or 4 neighboring neighborhoods. That might be 50, 100,000 people, whatever the scale you want to do it of. It could be a bit smaller than that. And we're going to focus on strengthening these neighborhoods as part of a strategy to try to eventually strengthen more neighborhoods. They could hire. So first of all, I'd be very intentional. I might not do the whole city. I might focus on several neighborhoods in which we have very close connections. We're physically next to, and people from our university could spend much more time in those places. So I would be hiring from those neighborhoods. I would be doing some physical investment in the infrastructure and the commercial spaces. I would be encouraging the establishment of small businesses. I would be encouraging students and faculty to spend more money in those neighborhoods. I'd be looking at the university supply chain. What are we buying that we could be buying locally? So I think you could think on the physical level. You could think on the physical level. I first mean that we as embodied people, we spend more time. I think we can think about investments in terms of what we do. I think in terms of buying, we can do. I think in terms of training, we could do things. And I think also we could actually have initiatives. We could have centers. We could have researchers that were actually spending time thinking about this problem of neighborhoods, this problem of cities. I mean, Johns Hopkins has some people doing that. Are they very intentional on Baltimore? I couldn't tell you because it's not where I work. I work in the International Affairs School. That's my day job is fragile states, not fragile neighborhoods. That's just like my second job. So I would just say that the university could be much more in terms of its brain power, investing in ideas that help neighborhoods and cities do more. And they could be piloting them and working with the government and the neighborhood leaders. There's a foundation. I'd say one more thing. There's a local foundation. In fact, there's several. Baltimore's well known for its local foundations. And there's at least one of them that I'm familiar with that invests significantly in neighborhood leaders and neighborhood initiatives. And that's something that Johns Hopkins should do much more of. It should do less big planning and more lots of incremental things that actually can make a incremental real difference in people's lives in the short term.
Okay. Now, when it comes to the decline of cities, I think two things tend to happen, or maybe two at the same time. One is that when you mentioned certain assets that are important to the city's life, it goes away. For example, um, automotive factories in, say, Detroit. Um, and another reason would be in certain West Coast cities where the uh, due to, I suppose, bad governance, certain quality of life troubles, such as violent crimes and street crimes, they seem to rise. To what extent are these two causes connected and can happen at the same time, even?
So you're asking the rise of crime and the decline of cities. Do I understand
Yeah.
you correctly?
Yes. Yes.
I mean, clearly the rise of crime is very dangerous for cities because it can, I mean, you yourself know something about investment. I mean, people do not want to invest in an insecure climate. I mean, if you look at a place like Baltimore, there's many reasons why it doesn't attract a lot of investment, but surely one of them is people don't feel as safe in many parts of the city as they want to. And that can be residential investors, like I literally want to invest in my home. It can be small businesses. It can be big companies. It can be startups. I think security of person, place, property, security of my assets. These are all things that people think about. I don't think we think about it as intentionally or systematically as a business might, but even on a personal level, we think about it. So surely anything that makes a city unsafe is very dangerous. And I think you see, if you talk about cities that are struggling today in the United States, they're always going to be connected to something to do with crime. Of course, they're also always going to be connected to possibly the loss of some economic engines. I mean, my focus is social more than economic, but I think if you think about a place as being insecure, what is your initial reaction if you live in or near that place? You withdraw from the place. I'm less likely to be on the street. I'm less likely to talk to my neighbor. I'm less likely to join a local association. I'm less likely to hang out the park if it's somehow not safe. So I think in terms of social, but if you think about economic, I mean, the big risk for city is they lose their economic anchors and they lose their sense of safety. It's hard for me to think of two things and anything beyond those two things that would be more important for cities in terms of their well-being. At least there's larger issues like demographics and so on and so forth, but those are pretty good. So I definitely think they're connected. And I think if you look across the United States, I mean, there's many reasons why people might not want to be in San Francisco, which gets a lot of bad publicity recent years, or Portland, but surely it is concerns on safety. So I think that if I'm a mayor or I'm a city official, I do not want to compromise on safety. I'm not sure everyone agrees with me because some people feel that if you're too tough on safety, some people are going to jail or being prosecuted. But for me, that would be the first thing, the very simple thing. When people aren't safe, everything else is harder to do.
And I'm sure you're probably familiar with Jane Jacobs and her great work, The Death and Life of
Wonderful.
American
Yeah,
City.
she's also quoted. It's great that you found one quote, but she's also, I think she's in the book twice.
Mhm. Now, to what extent can Jane Jacobs's insights on urban health be applied today?
Well, I think she's brilliant. I mean, you can learn so much from just delving into her thinking. And she was so far ahead of her time. We have a lot of people talking about these issues today, but it was definitely ahead of her time. And this idea of eyes on the street, this idea that, I mean, I write about how cities should be centered around neighborhoods and not centered around silos. I mean, I didn't know this when I wrote it, but someone told me that she said the same thing in some of her work. And so you can find, and her idea that neighborhoods matter and small businesses are important to the well-being of neighborhoods and multifunctional zoning. And I mean, there's so many things. I mean, there's there's many, many things. I can't say that every single thing she says is relevant, and I can't say I remember everything she's written or that I've read everything she's written. I mean, beyond her major works. I know someone who actually published the book, and it's a compilation of many, many smaller things that she wrote. So there must be like 25 or 30 different pieces in there. So she's written quite a lot. She has many books, but her basic ideas still resonate with me. I think are still very important. And I think, I mean, you can just read them and learn. I mean, that's how good she was.
Okay. Now, the way I see it as someone who unfortunately has not been to America before, who has only seen it from afar, is that America's a great place if you're wealthy. It's basically Disneyland for you. It's a bit more precarious if you're middle class. And it's definitely not a good place if you're poor. And no matter what race or ethnicity you happen to be in, whether you're a urban dweller or a rural person. And of course, J.D. Vance in Hillbilly Elegy, and of course also Rob Henderson in his book Trouble also raised some key insights on this one. Um, how has I guess America as a whole tried and failed to address poverty in its borders?
So, I mean, you're for a person who says he's never been in America, you're quite well informed.
No, thank you.
I mean, it's hard for me to tell that you haven't been here because it clearly seems that you're following our culture and you're following our social trends. I mean, following the presidential election is not so hard, but to actually know what people are reading and what they're talking about, I mean, it certainly shows an appreciation for some of the things going on within society. So I strongly believe in prevention. And I believe once you end up with the foster child system, which is the Rob Henderson story, the foster care system, or once you end up with, in both cases, Rob Henderson and J.D. Vance are talking about family breakdown and not having alternatives. I mean, actually, in his case, J.D. Vance's case, he had a grandmother. In Rob Henderson's case, he didn't have alternatives. And it's also possibly they're some years apart and their geography is different. And I think that might play some reason for the difference. I mean, Appalachia, the extended family is likely more important than in California. So that could be a pure coincidence. Again, one data point does not make a trend, but it is true that there is a stronger kinship network and sense of extended community in Appalachia. And he didn't grow up in Appalachia, but he grew up among people who are from Appalachia, central. This is the mountain belt. And I believe his family's from someplace in eastern Kentucky or something. I don't remember exactly where, but somewhere around there. And California is much more individualistic and much more atomized. So you could think of the difference between the two. But going back to your question, I think it's important that many, many social problems from basically family breakdown to the drug crisis that the country faces, to the loneliness crisis, and I think even the mistrust and how that affects our politics. And now we have more recently the problem of phone addiction and mental health challenges for kids. I think all of this can be traced back to basically the weak society, weak community, weak family. And if you want to have a prevention, a country that can prevent these problems, you need a country that has a very strong society. And we have it in bits, we have it in pieces. Too much of our strong society, the parts of it are connected to the upper classes. I mean, there's books on marriage and caste, for example, which, I mean, we wouldn't call it caste, but it basically means that the stronger family and stronger social network households do better than those that have neither. And so I think we have a great conundrum because we do want to help people in need, and therefore we need a foster care system. We need social welfare. But ultimately, if you want to address these problems, there's no better recipe than, for me, a flourishing neighborhood, flourishing households, flourishing interfamily dynamics, and lots of local associations and lots of a dense social density place by place. So there's a web of support for every child. And that is the best way for children to be raised in a healthy environment and to get the support they need to thrive and to eventually enter a society where they can succeed and not be poor. I mean, poverty used to be the norm. I mean, if you're in Vietnam and you went back, I mean, let's go post-Vietnam War, but if you went back, let's say 40 years, mostly everybody would be poor. And today you're in a situation where there's, I don't know the numbers, but there's not so many people that are very poor. You have some poor, but you don't have the kind of poverty you might have had during the war or up until the 80s and before the reform era. And now once you have an economy that's pretty dynamic, likely the places or the people that are poorest, they're going to be the places that are the most disconnected from the more dynamic economic centers. They're going to be the families that are somewhat dysfunctional. They're going to be in the areas where there's not a lot of social cohesion, and there's some sort of family or community breakdown or just great disconnection. Disconnection is also a major form of, it can be a major driver of poverty. Disconnection from each other, disconnection from centers of dynamism, disconnection from institutions and opportunity. So if you're asking me about poverty, I mean, I think the major problem that we have is a weak society and to a certain extent, weak families and weak extended family support networks and weak community. And I think that is the best starting point to address these problems. Not that we can't deal with we can't ignore the downstream problems, but the more we go upstream and the more we strengthen society, the less we'll have to deal with it downstream.
Now, to what extent are the problems that affect the health of rural areas different from those affecting urban areas?
I mean, the most obvious is they're more disconnected, as I just described. This disconnection is if you think about what I write about and what I focus on, at the heart of it is how connected or how disconnected places are. And so rural areas, and they have a positive and they have a negative. And the positive side is they tend to have a culture that's more about solidarity and connecting to one another. That is not true everywhere. That is certainly true in some places. In other places, it's not. So that would be a positive force if it's there. And I think if you go to like the upper Midwest or Midwest, you look at the data, they have high data on social capital. If you go to like the rural South, you have the opposite, pretty bad data on social capital. So I couldn't speak from personal experience, but I've certainly seen rural areas that had strong social ties. On the negative side is you might have worse, the density of institutions and people is less. And ultimately, when we talk about connectiveness, we're talking about the density of institutions, economic, religious, social, civic, government. I mean, I've been in some counties, not towns, counties in which they basically have two institutions that work. They have the county government, which only exists in the county seat or the county capital, and that might be an office or two and might not be a lot of people. And then you have the school system. I mean, I wrote about this in one of my chapters. You have the schools. The schools mostly work. The schools are more out there near where people live. And you may not have much else. You probably have a few churches, but the churches might not be doing terribly well. Rural churches are not doing great right now. And so, and you have very little philanthropy. And if a part of that part of the country is doing badly, some rural areas are doing very well. But if you're in a part of the country where like Appalachia, in which there's not much, I mean, the most of the economy was owned by outsiders, almost like a developing country, and they have left, and those industries are in decline. So what do you have? You have not many economic institutions. You have not many government institutions. You have not many civic institutions. You have not many religious institutions. You have not many philanthropic institutions. Boy, it's really hard to uplift those places. And mostly those places have significant declines in population because of what is going on. So I was in Kentucky in, let's say, about 5-6 weeks ago, and I remember looking at the data, and they had a part of central Kentucky doing pretty well, and eastern and western Kentucky, some counties losing 10 to 15% of the population over, I don't remember how many years, but it gets harder and harder to succeed if you're losing so many people.
So how would you explain the failures of such programs like the war on poverty, the war on drugs, and I suppose No Child Left Behind? Is it because at heart these are grand national programs that fail to account for the local?
It's hard to generalize across quite different programs, but I would say the idea that we can spend a lot of money and solve social problems, and there can be an approach that's mostly top down. And when the United States is a vast country, I mean, Vietnam is, I mean, you tell me, but Vietnam probably, what is Vietnam? The size of California, maybe smaller than the size of California,
I
probably
would say
smaller than
smaller. Yeah,
California.
smaller.
And I mean, roughly similar shape, instead of facing this way, it's sort of, if you look at the geography, it faces west and California faces east.
Yep.
It's probably they both face away from the water. There must be some history about why it's that way. But and not that the water is not important for Vietnam. The water is everything, because that's where your trade routes come from. So I would say that this is a vast country. And so generally, I do think the federal government has some role to play, possibly in creating incentives, sometimes in distributing resources, but really hard to have a one-size-fits-all approach. I mean, the war on poverty, if you look at the two big upticks in the federal government, one during the New Deal, 1930s, versus the war on poverty in the 1960s, I think, generally speaking, there's a broad consensus that the New Deal worked to the extent that it could. And I mean, again, not everybody will agree with all aspects of it, but the point was it achieved some significant accomplishments. And then people would say that many people would think, again, this is partly what part of the political spectrum you're on, but there'd be much less consensus on the New Deal across the political spectrum. Like someone like Ronald Reagan, he was, who's of course a Republican, he would be pro-New Deal, but he'd be anti the war on poverty, partly because he thought it would be too ambitious, something that wasn't realistic. Again, you can't have a war on poverty. I don't think there's any country in the world without poverty. I mean, the People's Republic of China probably advertises they've eliminated poverty, but I would put money on it that they haven't. And so I would just say that I think that you could provide resources, you can provide tools, you can provide incentives, but the idea that there's a war, and I would say, broadly speaking, if you're looking for a cross-cutting lesson, I would say this idea that we don't quite understand our theory of change, if you understand what I mean by that, our theory of change is not a realistic one and not based upon what success actually is. Success actually is strong institutions, strong community, and without these, I think everything else is harder to achieve. So to the extent that any national program weakens local institutions, again, think family, think interfamily, think civic, social, religious, economic. We definitely need national dynamic companies. We need national dynamic civic institutions, nonprofits, and so on and so forth. But to the extent that you don't lead with the local and have local institutions being very important, and that's not just public, a lot of that has to be private. I think everything that we try to do with these programs becomes harder. And I would say too often we think of success as a material, some sort of material goal or material need that we're trying to ameliorate. And we think of it only on the individual basis, which means, again, we downplay institutions, we downplay the role of place, we downplay the relationships between people. We don't thrive because we are alone. We're thrive because we're embedded in lots of strong institutions and support networks. And these programs don't take into account any of that. And to a certain extent, they weaken them.
Now, one of the great social scientists of this era is Robert Putnam. And of course, you and I are both thinking of the book, say, Bowling Alone, and his more recent one is Our Kids. Now, as much as Putnam has been a mainstay in American political discourse, it seems that ever since he wrote Bowling Alone, even not much has changed in regards to community relations. I would argue that in many cases it's gotten worse. So, how have we failed to learn from Putnam's literature?
Well, I would say a few things. His original article was 1995, and his book is 2000. So we're now in 2024. He wrote several books after that. He wrote American Grace about the role of religion in promoting pro-social values and local. So he talked about the importance of religion. And of course, religion has been in decline. He wrote Our Kids, which talks about the difference in two families, but it's basically, he's not emphasizing as much as I would, but he's actually talking about the difference between two neighborhoods. And then his last book, which might be his last book in his career, which is The Upswing, in which he basically updates Bowling Alone in a more broad, basically saying that we are today like we were in the late 19th century. And then we had an enormous amount of building social institutions in what we call the progressive era, 1880s, 90s, 1900, 1910s. And then we had about 50 years, 60 years of strengthening solidarity, strengthening social support systems around us, strengthening community. And this peaked, and then I believe the data point is 1964. And then we went down. And so he basically calls that we have to go up again. And this is the same thing that I would call for in my book. I think where Robert Putnam is the single best person on raising these issues and identifying the data and the trends behind them and calling attention to the problem. He, of course, has not done a lot to show us what we might do to fix the problem. And so my book really is an attempt to build on what he did and then add two things. Say, one, place matters in a way that you haven't emphasized, and I focus on neighborhoods. And two, here are possible solutions. This is what we have to do. And then I look at these organizations and show that what are they doing to tackle this problem and how could we replicate or scale up some of those ideas. And so, but I think you're correct. Things have only gotten worse. I think if you hear him speak at all, he will say things have only got worse. I think he wants to be hopeful, but doesn't know how to be hopeful because he doesn't see a positive turn in any of the data. I would say from my experience, talking to people and traveling the country and visiting a lot of places, I can be somewhat hopeful because I see the energy, I see the desire, I see the movement more towards the local and the desire to build things and make local places work better and to put more energy in the local instead of the national. So I see movement in that direction. The big question is, does it pick up steam? Does it get more energy? Does the government and do we make changes in our political and economic systems to accelerate the energy that's there currently. I think there's energy there. I think people are working in this area in a way they haven't in recent decades. And now it's up to us to find ways to catalyze, accelerate the trend so that much more will be done that way. And I think the one positive is, the internet and technology mostly divides us, but to the extent that you can live anywhere and be connected to opportunity. I have former classmates that moved back home to be with their family in the community they grew up with, and they can do that because they can work remotely and they can be in touch with, the same way you can be in Vietnam and know what's the latest thing in the United States, they can be in Cleveland, or they can be in Wichita, or they can be in southern Minnesota, and they can do things, be connected to the larger conversation, yet they can play a major role in what is happening locally. So I think that's all very important.
So how has the COVID pandemic affected community health, broadly speaking?
I think it really depends where you are, but I think the positive from COVID is that it's made people more aware of their surroundings, made them more desirous to be in a place where they know people, and elevated the importance of neighborhoods in people's minds. Does that lead to longer term change? I don't know, but I think and just in what happened during COVID, my neighborhood responded, activated. We already had the strong bonds. So once you have the strong bonds, we're here for each other. We are always here to solve problems when they arise. And COVID turned out to be just one more problem, a big problem, but one more in a series of problems that we're always working together to solve. If people don't know each other and they don't have an abundance of institutions and leaders, they're not used to solving problems with each other. And when COVID hits, it can be more isolating, more alienating, more makes people angry. But we had none of that. And so any place that's community strong, they're ready for these challenges.
Of course,
I think if I know something of your background, and I don't know your background well, but if you're in the entrepreneurial space, an entrepreneur is not going to succeed without a good ecosystem around them. Much harder to succeed if you live in a place in which there's not the culture, not the lawyers, not the technology or the human resources, not the government support. So you can think of it as an ecosystem, and an entrepreneur only succeeds if they have, no matter how smart they are, they need an ecosystem around them to succeed. So I think the same ways that we as individuals or our families or even us as a community, we are only going to do well when something like COVID happens, when we have that ecosystem in place beforehand, so we're ready to face the challenge or leverage the opportunity in a way that helps advance our common destiny.
I understand. And of course, to your point, my background is unfortunately not in business or entrepreneurship. Just a spectator and
It's not.
in culture and society.
Oh, really? I thought that was your background. So I don't know your full background, but somehow I see this on. It could be that you have a different. I don't know. I'm not quite sure your background, because someone with your exact name in your exact location is doing entrepreneurship. So is your day job, what is your day job, if I may ask? Could you share a little bit of that? I don't know if your audience knows that, but I actually don't know it in great detail.
Okay, so I'm currently doing my master's studies in American Studies in Budapest, Hungary. So that's my day
How
job.
are you?
Yes.
Okay, you're not, I don't actually know your full background, actually, so I apologize for that. So that's good. So you live in Budapest.
Yes.
It's a very nice city. Yes, it's wonderful. Buda and Pest. Yes, I remember it very well.
Oh yeah, I've learned to enjoy it. I'm still trying to learn Hungarian to I suppose.
Yeah, not an easy language. Very hard.
No,
It's much harder than I think if you spoke Korean or Japanese, it would be a little easier because there's some historical connection, however distant. But Vietnamese is quite different, and so is English.
And of course, there's a lot of American interest in Hungary right now due to the current government. But I can see that there's a lot of misunderstandings too, being an American.
I don't think people, I've not been in Hungary recently. You know, it's very hard to understand a society from afar unless you spend a good amount of time in it. And I think Hungary has become like a cultural war issue in the United States. People on the left, including the New York Times, they look for every problem in Hungary. And people on the right, they look for every positive feature of Hungary. And I think it's probably much more complex, like every culture and every society I've ever looked at in my life.
Yes, and
I mean, there's probably some good and some bad. And the head of the country, Viktor Orban, I mean, some people vilify him, some people glorify him, and I'm pretty sure he deserves both, and at different times for different reasons. So it's all very complicated.
yes, and knowing what I know about living in Budapest and knowing what I know about the Orban government is there are good things and bad things to be said about both. And I don't think I don't think valorization or vilification is an answer. We should just treat Hungary or Orban as any other country and any other political figure. You know, assess it in a rather fair and balanced manner. But
Yeah, I mean, I think that's true about everything.
but of
So
course,
I see here. I mean, this is a podcast about me. So you work on something called the Aristotle Foundation for Public Policy.
yes, I occasionally contribute articles for them. The last of which was
Interesting. I'm not even familiar
last
with
month.
it.
Yeah. It was I believe last year I interviewed the director of the institute. He is an editor of a collection of essays titled "The 1867 Project: Why Canada Should Be Cherished and Not Cancelled." So it's a Canada Day read, so to speak. And yeah, it was during Canada Day too, which is the 1st of July. So I managed to know him from there. And eventually he wanted to publish one of my articles, and I'm very much grateful for that.
Interesting. Interesting. And what is the focus of your studies in particular?
So I would like to focus on American history in general, and in particular, I am doing my thesis, my master's thesis on the 1896 presidential election.
This is, remind me, this is who won the 1896 presidential election?
So William McKinley, but I would say
McKinley. I was going to guess McKinley won, and then he got shot shortly afterwards.
yes, but I think it may have been during his second term, so 19.
Second term. He got shot. So he had one term before he was shot. Got it. So and he beat a populist candidate.
That's yeah, William Jennings Bryan. So
This is the fight about the silver. Yeah, the silver about the silver. I think he wanted to put everything on the gold or silver standard or something. This is probably a major theme in the campaign.
yes, and of course it'll be a major
Got it.
in my thesis too.
Got it. How interesting. Yes, you can see that part of my American history is a bit sketchy, but I did get a couple of points right, a couple of points wrong as well.
Yes. I
Yeah,
believe
I don't think that time period, our history is known for having the best until you got like Teddy Roosevelt and then Woodrow Wilson for all of his faults. Those are people we all know, but like the end of the 19th century, they're mostly like people we don't remember.
and I think
It's
that's why.
amazing. That was when we were becoming like an economic superpower, and we didn't have we had basically insignificant presidents to a certain extent. So it just shows how politics is not the most important driver of a country. And I mean, obviously, politicians can play a very important role, but we should never overestimate in most. Obviously, there are exceptions like a Napoleon, but or a Winston Churchill, but for the most part, in a stable democracy or a stable political regime, even Vietnam is a pretty stable political system. You often have leaders, and what matters is not the leaders, but actually what else is going on in the society and the economy and in the general geopolitical context.
Yes. Yes, and I would say the period from the end of Reconstruction to the First World War is a period of American history that is mostly obscured to, I guess, the
Yes, it's very
average
obscure.
American.
Yeah. Probably the most famous incident, I guess, in McKinley's term would be 1898, the war with Spain.
Yes,
Yeah, that's
and
probably the thing that we remember the most. Yes, I would be hard pressed to name you every president from 1896 to 1912. From 18 from not 18 from 18 probably from 18 actually from 18 after Lincoln was assassinated, and I guess that would be 1865 until 1912. I mean, we know Teddy Roosevelt, and I'm trying to think of who else we would know. But yeah, so good luck. It's a good topic.
yes,
I think there's a lot to learn on that era, actually.
of course. And I suppose one thing I could tell you is that almost all of the presidents of that era would be all Republicans, maybe save for Cleveland.
That's the truth. I think Wilson was the first. Wilson must have been the first Democrat for some time.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I suppose let's go back to your book.
Please ask questions. Go right ahead.
Okay. Um, so a very important American figure in the 19th century, I suppose honorary American, Alexis de Tocqueville. Uh,
Yes.
I do not have his exact quote on individualism in mind, but he said that it is in some ways a feature of alienation of man's tendency to see themselves as a self-contained organism, and he sees it
I
as
think we might have that quote in the last chapter of my book. I do quote him something like that. So he's quoted several times in the last chapter. So we have something like that. And I do think it's the risk that we see more and more today of people becoming disconnected and self-interested. I mean, this is a long-standing trend, but I think the smartphones have accelerated it.
and of course recently the um the professor John Haidt has raised the alarm on the dangers of both cell phone and social media, which I think
Yes.
is quite staggering, really, because both of these devices are invented for the purpose of connecting people to one another, and what they end up is dividing us and making us more agitated as individuals.
Yes. I mean, I totally agree. I've written one piece for his Substack, and I have another that should come out any day now. And I think what he misses, he says we went from play-based to phone-based, but and they acknowledge it if you pay attention after they've seen my work, that we lost the community before and the loss of community led to the loss of play, which made people especially vulnerable to the rise of smartphones. And so I think if you live in my community, we don't have problems with smartphones. We have a strong community, and we have strong controls over technology, and we have strong ways to promote relationships in a way that the general society does not. And I think this is one of the great challenges. And just before I forget, I just looked it up. If you haven't read it, I recommend the book, The Age of Acrimony by John Greenspan. If you don't know, if you're not reading that book as part of your PhD, it's how Americans fought to fix their democracy 1865 to 1915. I have a quote from that book as well, and I found that book quite wonderful on that era.
Yes.
If you haven't read it, maybe you already know it, but please keep marching on.
Of course, and I think I'll be very interested in reading that book. What I find to be quite astounding in that era of American politics is how someone like, I suppose, William Jennings Bryan can be an effective politician in connecting uh, certain national issues or certain very obscure issues like what our currency is based on to very real local issues. And I think in some ways it takes a master level politician to do that. And I'm not sure that many of our contemporary politicians, America and elsewhere, are able to do so.
I think it's true. I mean, just this morning, I'm listening to a podcast about Abraham Lincoln's speeches. And so, I mean, if you can imagine, I mean, first there were the speeches was the entertainment. There was not, I mean, obviously there was a lot of other entertainment, but not the kind of media we have here. And so he didn't just make speeches or look for opportunities to make speeches that would be newsworthy. He actually published speeches that he didn't actually give. And the annual report to Congress that is televised in a big deal for the first 100 years of American history, that was actually a printed, not a spoken event. And so, but I think the point is, when you're in an age like today, the media ecosystem does not promote depth of thought, does not promote the kind of politicians that appeal to sophisticated arguments. It's more simple messaging and at best a few ideas. I mean, for the Trump campaign, it's about strength and those who've been ignored by the elites. And I mean, what are the policies? Strength at the border, strength against China. There's not a lot of other, but good, strong economic management. I mean, just some big themes, sometimes more negative than positive, and there's very little detail. And I don't think you could have detail. I mean, we had President Obama, and he was a pretty good speaker and had some notable speeches. And but I can't think of many. I mean, Ronald Reagan was known for being a great communicator. Did he have the sophistication of speech like a Martin Luther King or an Abraham Lincoln? Definitely not. But I do think you can certainly find speeches that are worthwhile from some politicians, but I don't think it's the norm. I don't think the media ecosystem is encouraging that in any way today. So you're getting people that are not having the depth of argument, that definitely not.
Yeah, and I think it's a note that we can end on. So I wonder, is the problems affecting American media, real or imagined, the result of the changing media landscape, or is it the result of people being more divisive, having a louder voice?
I think you could argue that there's multiple drivers. I mean, certainly the media ecosystem changes the incentives, but I also think there's been some cultural changes which are not related to the media directly, might be related to the fact that our society is more atomized. As Putnam would say, we're less a we. I mean, you can see his analysis of printed material. If you read his last book, the usage of the word we versus the word I, and we're much more I versus we. And what that means is people, and I think Yuval Levin has argued this well in his previous book, not his current book, that basically our institutions, we're not, I mean, he uses the thing formation versus performative versus formative. I think it's probably better to say we focus on the mission of the organization, or we focus on our own values and our own mission to get ahead. And I think what you see in the media is too much of the media is focused on individuals trying to achieve more, and too many and too much is focused on people trying to bring their values and into the media and not performing their basic jobs.
Well, I think we can end on that note. Thank you very much, Seth Kaplan, for joining the program.
Thank you so much. My pleasure to be with you. And by all means, do find me on LinkedIn, find me on my website, follow me, email me. My pleasure if I can be helpful to anybody.